I put together a slide deck for this a few days ago, which I've sent in. I discover that Sophie and I have quite a lot of slides in common.
We got them all from Chris.
Now,
And it showed half of her.
this isn't very surprising, since we worked very closely together in the 1980s for the period of relevance. But I'm going to have to make some stuff up as I go along. I'll try and find something new to say. So what am I going to talk about? The title of my talk is From Arms to Brains. And so it's a kind of a bit of a life story from my point of view. It's going to cover the stuff you're interested in and a little bit about my more recent research at Manchester, building the SpiNNaker machine, which is a machine for modelling brains that incorporates over 1 million ARM processors, so it's still ARM related. And how do we get there? But I'm going to talk about, from little acorns, building brains. And I'm going to give a little bit of a kind of career perspective. 40 years of Moore's Law. Now, you've heard Moore's Law mentioned already several times. How many people know what Moore's Law is? See, my wife is ignorant of it.
Well, that's not very polite.
Of that and possibly some others. Anyway, I'll explain that when we get there. And then a quick summary at the end. And as with all the other talks, if a question comes to mind as I'm going through, feel free to raise your hand and I may or may not spot it, all right? It's, depending on how we're going. So let's start with From Little Acorns. Now, as I said, there's rather a lot of this in common with Sophie's talk, so you've seen that picture before. In fact, I'm fairly sure you must have got that slide from me, because I'm the only one who uses this red colour scheme for the titles.
I think we both got it from Chris, but yeah.
Oh, we got bits of it from Chris, yes. For those of you who don't recognise it instantly, there's one of these outside. This is the Science of Cambridge MK14, and I hand-wired the first version of this, which was based on a National Semiconductor Development Kit. And I hand-wired VeriWire. Anybody remember VeriWire, little wiring pens? I put one of these together and tried to get it working, and there was a bug in the software, which had been copied from a ROM to a PROM, but the copy hadn't worked perfectly, so there were bugs in it. Anyway, that used the SCMP processor. We've already heard that a couple of those went into this fruit machine controller for ACE. I think it was for ACE fruit machine. We have somebody from ACE here today. So you're confessing to that.
Yeah, I owned the company until 1993.
All right, so you knew all about this at the time. All right, okay. I don't think we ever met, did we? No. And we, CPU Limited cut its teeth on this kind of stuff. And Sophie used a phrase that came up many times in the course of her career, which was to look at the MK14 and basically say, yeah, I could do better than that. And then she came back with this one. Again, you've seen this slide before. This was the Acorn System 1 with a 6502 and a hex keypad, hexadecimal display. How much memory?
On the baseboard, there's a kilobyte.
1K of RAM, yeah. But it's built on a standard Eurocard, and so you can build the System 1 as a standalone system, but you can actually put a connector onto the card and you can plug it into a rack and you can start building the larger systems. Now, around this time, Clive Sinclair was pushing his ZX80 and later ZX81 computers, and if you remember, he made the proud boast at that time that a ZX80 had enough compute power to control a nuclear power station. Everybody remember that? Well, we outdid him on that. Who recognised this?
Yes.
Blake 7. I'm sort of looking at the age of the audience. And who remembers Blake 7? And Blake 7 was a 22nd century cargo ship, I think, interstellar cargo ship of some sort. And at the centre of its control was this computer, which is recognisably an Acorn System 1, you see. So that's obviously a much more challenging computer task than just a nuclear power station.
They were actually using it to control the two hemispheres.
I remember you telling me that you looked very carefully and the button sequence they pushed in the TV was actually the right sequence to start a program running.
Yes, there was one where the spaceship died for some reason and they had to restart it. And yes, they did press RR twice on the System 1 keyboard to make that happen.
So there you are, they actually knew how to drive it as well as using it as a prop. And as I say, with that card you could then plug it into a rack and put other boards in. And one of my, I mean, I wasn't working for Acorn at this time. Well, I wasn't paid by Acorn.
Don't worry, we weren't either.
No, well, I was Rolls-Royce Research Fellow at Emmanuel College in Cambridge and doing a little bit of moonlighting for Acorn, and the deal was I would design some interesting stuff, I'd give them the designs and they'd give me some bits to make the next interesting thing, which seemed like a fair deal. And I was using these computers in my aerodynamics experiments in the engineering department. So there was some synergy with my day job, I like to tell myself. And now, is this my computer or is this?
That's a System 5.
That's a System 5. I have something very similar, which is actually in the museum here somewhere.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, the one is.
Yeah,
Where is it?
That's a single.
Last time I saw it was on a rack round the corner there.
Right. Not sure I've seen it. Well, no, I had my old 2650 system, which is a single rack, and I had effectively the thing I developed the proton ideas in, which is a double rack.
That's in flash storage or something.
Over there somewhere. Oh.
It's been preserved. So it's not out because it's too precious. So it's been actually like preserved in a museum sense.
Think of a computer.
Set in ASPIC, yes. Yeah. And these systems, you know, they were selling. They were very expensive. They were mainly used by professionals for control purposes. We've heard all that. And then Chris Curry decided he wanted to go for the consumer market, and with Nick Toop developed the atom about which we've heard almost enough. I think the other anecdote I would repeat is the machine was prone to overheating, and it had a linear voltage regulator at the back of the circuit board, and if you had a few add-ons in there, this voltage regulator will get hot enough to melt its own solder and drop out of the board, at which point if you shook it you had a sound generator. That was the claim. But I mean, the atom was important. I mean, Sophie said some fairly critical comments about it, but I think without the atom, Acorn would not have been in the running for the BBC Micro contract, because the atom kind of established Acorn as a credible source of home computing. And while working out what to do after that, well, you've seen this picture before as well. I like to show this picture just to prove that once upon a time I had hair, right? But we've already had the hair joke, so.
Who are the other two fellas?
Well,
I remember the guy facing the camera's face, but not his name. I assume he's here somewhere.
it was Alan, wasn't it? Is Alan here?
Alan Wright.
Alan Wright, sounds right, yes.
That name rings a bell.
Yes.
And that looks totally like the back of Kim Smith-Jones, but
It's red hair. Is KSJ red-haired?
No.
No. Anyway, there we are. And you've heard how a result of that and bits of Herman trickery led us to getting the BBC microcomputer contract. And that's what the machine looks like. There are several around these buildings. If you want to see one, I've signed at least one BBC micro case already today. So this was the Acorn marketing department's view of the BBC Micro. My view was more like this. This is the circuit board inside the Micro. This board, if fully populated, would hold 102 chips. And the chips are these boring looking black rectangles of varying sizes scattered all over the board. And each chip performs a function. One in the middle is the 6502, which is the computer at the heart of the BBC Micro. The ones on the right hand side are memory chips, a bit smaller. There are some logic chips which just have a handful of gates in, and so on. Bottom right are the ROMs. And at that time, in the early 80s, it was relatively easy to start a computer company, because what you do is you decide on your computer based on standard parts that you could go out and buy from the various suppliers. You could design a circuit, build a machine, shove it in a plastic case and try and sell it. And there were hundreds of companies doing that. It was a hugely competitive field at the time. And basically that's what the BBC Micro is, with a couple of exceptions. So 2 of those anonymous black rectangles on there are the ULAs that we had designed specially for the BBC Micro. This one is the VidProc, and that handled the real-time video stream, gave us all sorts of trouble. And this is the SurProc, which handled things like the RS-232 interface, and as far as I can remember, never gave us any trouble at all.
The cassette interface, not the RS-232 interface.
Cassette. I've said this on Thursday, you know. The tradition is I make statements and then Sophie corrects me. You know. and Sophie is pretty nearly always right, by the way, so that's okay. But each of these chips, each of these ULAs replaces order 10 or 20 standard little logic chips. So without those 2 ULAs, the board would have had 150 chips on and being 50% bigger, and you would have had to fold it in 2 to fit it in the case, and that wouldn't have worked well. So this was my first exposure to, custom chip design. Now, custom, in the case of a ULA, was quite limited. The ULA offered you a sea of bipolar transistors and 1 layer of metal customization. So you could basically design a single layer of wiring to connect these transistors together, connecting in each cell 2 2-input NOR gates or 1 3 or 4 input NOR gate. That was the logic that was on there. And you're probably thinking, well, how on earth can you possibly wire a complicated circuit in a single layer of metal? And the answer is that on the ULA, there were quite a number of places where there were what were called polysilicon underpasses. So basically you had a way of, if I needed to get this wire across that wire, I could go down into the silicon here and it would come out here. And that gave you enough flexibility to design useful functions. I believe we operated, particularly the video processor, at a very high utilization by normal standards. And that meant it overheated, and those of you who will remember, there were issues with the VidProc getting your BBC high-res displays sparkling, twinkling a bit when they shouldn't. And some of that was addressed by putting a fat resistor on the board, you can see next to it, to try and dissipate some of the excess voltage in that resistor. And then usually there'd be a metal heatsink stuck on top. And if you were really lucky, you'd get a VLSI technology second source chip that didn't have any problems.
That's the VTI chip.
That's the VTI chip, is it? You're right, it says VTI on it. That's why it hasn't got a heatsink. And I think that was NMOS.
I think it was NMOS too.
Right. I will, henceforth, when I show this slide, I will speak with greater confidence that it was an NMOS chip. Sorry?
It wouldn't have made any sense for it to be CMOS.
No, but it could have been CMOS. But I think this was a bit early for CMOS. Yeah. Anyway, so I was heavily involved in specifying the logic that went on these two ULAs. That was my introduction to microchip design, and basically that kind of set the basis for the rest of my career. Okay, I retired 18 months ago, and I'd still been doing things related to chip design up to that point. So what happened to the BBC Micro? Well, it had a big impact. We've heard about that. Got lots of computers in schools. Here's another ancient picture, also proving that I had hair. This was Kenneth Baker in the Cambridge Water Softening Station building, I think, at the front, talking to Chris Turner, and Herman's in the back, and I'm sort of skulking in the corner, and Chris Curry's over there, I think. So, it was quite high-profile activity in its day, and we were scratching our heads, wondering what we would do to build on the success of the BBC Micro. You've heard a lot of this story. Building second processors with any interesting looking possible successor processor we could think of. And the second processor was a very nice way of getting a new processor into a system that would work, and you could check its performance and so on. When we had some papers dropped on our desks, and there were several of these, but probably the most influential, industrially speaking, was The Case for the Reduced Instruction Set Computer by Patterson and Ditzel, based on the Berkeley RISC work. And again, you've probably heard enough about this, but the key idea behind RISC, which is kind of forgotten in today's processor architecture arguments, but the key idea is that the way that processors were going, which was ever increasingly complex instruction sets based on successful mini computers from the 1970s, such as the VAX, raising the level of abstraction of the instruction set architecture to be closer to the high level language. RISC was kind of the antithesis of that approach. It was saying, well, no, these aren't mini computers. You're trying to get your whole processor on a chip. Your chip has relatively limited transistor resources. Putting complex instructions on the chip burns a lot of transistors. If you kept the instruction set simple, you could use those transistors for something that delivered more performance. And the classic thing at that time was pipelining. Okay, complex processors are very hard to pipeline. I know they do it now. Well, actually, mainly they translate their complex instructions into internal RISC and then do it. But at that time, there wasn't the resource to do sophisticated pipelining with a complex instruction set. So we swallowed this argument, and it became the basis of a sort of experimental project thinking about designing our own processor. Sophie led on the instruction set architecture with a few sort of kicks from me. So, well, mainly a no, you can't do that sort of hint. And the project gradually moved, and you've heard enough about this, I don't need to repeat it, into a fully fledged project. It was strongly associated in its early days with an activity that was set up in Palo Alto in America, where Jim Mitchell had been caught sort of on his way out of Xerox PARC. That was the time when a lot of people at Xerox PARC were leaving. I think this was the point at which Xerox, who made their money selling photocopiers, realized that half their research staff were talking about paperless offices. Wondered if this was a good idea. Anyway, these staff were floating around. Herman caught Jim Mitchell in midair and persuaded him to set up an Acorn research center in Palo Alto. And they were developing a new operating system called ARCS, with which there were subsequent issues. You can tell us about that later. But anyway, the project got on a formal footing, and you've heard quite a lot about how we organised this. I was responsible for the microarchitecture, which was captured in a reference model written in BBC Basic. Those are the days. 808 lines of BBC Basic captured the whole ARM, and it was basically an RTL model by today's terminology. And the fact that you can write the whole ARM description in 808 lines tells you how simple it was, okay? That's the kind of expression of simplicity. Who knows how big one of today's ARM models is in lines of code? There's plenty of people who work for ARM.
Bits bigger.
I'm guessing it's tens of thousands of lines of code.
It's a lot more than that, Steve. That's way low.
Is it?
Yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of lines of
I
code.
think 200 engineers for 2 years.
Yeah, okay.
All writing very long, full time.
Yeah, that underlines my statement, right? That this was simple, and the model was simple. And Jamie mentioned Mead and Conway. The ARM very much adopted the Mead and Conway design philosophy, even to the point of having a two-phase clock that was externally generated on the first ARM. So there's externally a cross-coupled pair of NAND gates, I think, and you fed a clock in, and they produced the two non-overlapping phases. So you have something happens here, and then it's safely secured, and then something happens here, and then you go back to this one. And that's how the whole processor operated and was captured in this BBC Basic program.
Steve, I'd like to assert that it's only 763 lines, which is a good thing because you only left 29 comments in.
You've been scrutinising my code. Yeah, well. It was written in BBC Basic, which is a self-commenting language. So. Yes, and the other parts of the working program was the instruction set validation suite. You've heard a fair bit about that. Hugo here was one of 3 or 4 people writing validation. John Thackeray was another. Jez Wills. Who was the other one?
Well, you had a slide that had a few other credits.
I mean, I don't
Yeah.
Yeah. Hugo had the sort of held the record for the largest number of vulgarities embedded in his code, though.
And I'll be talking more about that later.
Good. Excellent. And then I wrote block specs, basically turning my BBC Basic model into a textual description with logic tables and things to hand to the VLSI group, who would then take it away, implement it in transistors. Again, you've heard the data path was full custom layout. A lot of the control logic was based on a standard cell library that the group developed themselves. And I think you had basic tools for automating the assembly. Sorry? Oh, there were PLAs, which were different. Yes. Actually, we'll see that in a minute. Yeah, so here we are, 40 years later. What emerged was this first ARM chip. As you see, it's not called ARM1. You don't need to give it a number when it's the only one, right? That's the point. And you can also see on here, this is a repeat of the BBC Basic small sample of the reference model. This is the hand-drawn layout, where I think there's a copy around in the museum somewhere.
I've seen it here.
I think I still have the original. Oh, I'm not sure. And that was the data path, the sort of logical drawing of the data path. And the design approach was literally to sketch this on a piece of paper, photocopy it many times, and then take Sophie's instruction set and say, this instruction, phase 1, colour in what's happening. Phase 2, colour in what's happening. Second cycle, phase 1. So every cycle of every instruction had 2 coloured in versions of this to show what was supposed to happen. When you got to the point where you couldn't work out how to colour it in a sensible number of clock cycles, then there were 2 choices. One was to go back to Sophie and say, you can't have that instruction. Or the other one was to change the data path diagram. And that happened a few times. This is the final version, but it would then be adjusted. You could then throw all that first set of coloured in data paths into the bin and start again. And this is the layout. You can see the bottom, slightly over half the chip, is the data path. It's very regular. It's a 32-bit thing. So a lot of the time you have the same horizontal line repeated or possibly mirror imaged 32 times across the chip. Slight difference at this end because here we're seeing the 26-bit address bus. There's a circuit here which is used for incrementing and decrementing addresses. Hint, it never decrements. It only increments, but it has the capability of decrementing, just you can't use it. And the reason for that is quite late in the design, we decided we really ought to make the processor restartable. So that if you got an exception in the middle of an instruction, you could basically stop the world, fix up the exception, and go back and re-execute the instruction. And because Sophie had invented these rather complex load store multiple instructions, that was a bit of a nightmare. And the only way I could work out to solve it was to only ever increment the address here. So when you do a store multiple, which feels like you're pushing onto a stack going down memory, what the processor actually does is it jumps to the bottom and stores going up memory. Right? You've all got that. Good.
If you didn't go upwards, you would be able to have a good memory controller that's actually.
That's also true. It would break the sequential memory game. How am I doing for time? Is anybody paying any attention? I've got half an hour, have I? Okay. Right. So anyway, this all turned out rather well. You've heard a bit about a couple of bugs that ended up on the silicon. None were serious enough to cause major problems. The chip was highly usable and got built into evaluation systems and bootstrapped a whole lot of software development activity through second processors, some of which you can see around in here. But of course, this never went into a volume Acorn product because before that we'd moved to ARM2, which was going from 3 to 2 micron. That meant we could reliably support 8 megahertz operation. And that was the speed of memory at the time. And many people have asked the question, what was the secret to Acorn's success in designing a processor that was successful at the first time with a team who'd never designed a processor before, although knew quite a lot about using processors. And of course, our esteemed founder, Herman, has answered this question. And he says that compared with the big teams that were operating in mainstream industry, he gave us 2 significant advantages. The first advantage was no people. I mean, it wasn't quite 0, but it was, the entire team was about 10. Yeah, about 10. And the second advantage was no money. So basically, it was heavily based on home-built tools, not least BBC Basic, although, again, the VLSI team did have chip design tools brought in from outside, and we had some in-house VLSI chip design. I can never remember if those worked together at all.
No.
No, okay. And there's quite a lot of truth in this, although it's, you know, it's Herman retelling history, but it's not. There are things to think about in this. One of which is the very limited resource we had meant we really did have to focus on simplicity. And a lot of the design decisions on the ARM processor were decisions for simplicity. This carried over to the memory controller, which I also was design lead on. And there I looked at the way most people implemented memory control. This is probably getting a bit technical. They have table walking hardware that, you know, if you get a memory miss, you go and look up your address translation in 2 steps. We thought that's too complicated. We'll never make that work. So I came up with a way of doing this with a single cam lookup in memory. And Herman was a little bit nervous about this because it was different from what everybody else was doing. So he told me to go and check with David Wheeler at the computer lab. Go and see David, see if he thinks this idea is okay. And I went and, with some trepidation, explained my idea to David Wheeler on the whiteboard. And I said, well, do you think that will work? And he thought for a bit and he said, well, it seemed to work in Manchester in 1963. So I don't see why it shouldn't work now. And of course.
Famous for saying that.
What's that?
Wheeler was famous for saying that about anything, really.
Right.
It was either, well, we tried it in 1961, or, it won't work for the following reason, rediscovered in 1961.
Anyway, he's perfectly right. I mean, although, of course, the Manchester technology was quite different, architecturally, they were doing exactly what I was doing. Associative lookup. And then what happened? Well, of course, you've heard the story. Acorn found continuing to support ARM development expensive, and Apple came knocking at the door, and this was probably only weeks after I'd left Acorn to go to Manchester, because it hadn't started when I left. But ARM Limited was set up in November of 1990, which was only, I left 31st of July 1990. So very quickly, because Apple was basically knocking on an open door, you know, dear Acorn, would you like to shed the cost of all this expensive processor development? and it happened very quickly. And then the rest is well known. Again, I think you've even seen this picture before. The timing was very fortuitous. The 1990s were when system on chip became a phrase that people spoke about. And
I think we have seen that picture before. That's 75 from your dad.
is it? There you go. Anyway, it doesn't actually matter what it is. The point is, the number of transistors, you know, following Moore's law, about which more later, it was now possible to think about putting more than just the processor on a chip. But transistor resource was still finite, as it always will be. And the merits of a small processor that only used 25 or so thousand transistors was that it left much more resource for all the other stuff. So you know, it's a technical advantage completely unrelated to the original design goals. So serendipitous. But it was very useful, and this meant that ARM was small and low power. There was more room and more power budget available for the rest of the stuff. And you know what happened thereafter. To illustrate, you know, the ARM core on that chip is that little rectangle in the top left corner. So now it is surrounded by cache memory and memory management and other guff. But the basic processor is occupying a small bit of the chip. And 2023, ARM passed the 250 billion ARM-powered chips shipped, and that's now 300 billion, or is it 30 billion a year? Silly numbers. I know that in my last couple of years at Acorn, I spent a bit of time working with Malcolm Bird, trying to work out if we could establish a company around ARM, and the numbers never worked, because for the company to survive on royalties, you'd have to sell millions of chips a year, and that was inconceivable. So I left. So what did I do? Well, brings me on to my second topic, and this isn't the only thing I did at Manchester. I spent the 90s building asynchronous implementations of the ARM. That's versions of the ARM processor that operate without clocks. They run at whatever speed the silicon will let them run at. And there are a number of nice advantages of running asynchronously, and there are some disadvantages. But after 10 years of doing that, it became clear that industrial interest in that approach was not going to be very strong. And ARM's business had changed from selling hard cores at the beginning of the 90s, i.e. physically designed cores, to selling synthesizable cores at the end of the 90s. And the tools available for synthesizing asynchronous cores were way, way behind clocked cores. So I started to think about doing something else. And I got interested in what's the difference between computers and brains, okay? They're both information processing systems, yet, you know, computers can beat me at adding numbers together by a factor in the billions, but they can't do simple things that humans find easy, such as recognizing your mother, right? Okay, computers can do that now, but it's hard. So I started thinking, what could I do to contribute to understanding brains better so that we can see what these differences are? And I'm not the first to be interested in this. Ada Lovelace, about whom there's presumably stuff up in the museum somewhere, I'm not quite sure where. It was Babbage's assistant, and some people credit her with being the first person to think about programming computing machines. But among her notes, she says, "I have my hopes of one day getting cerebral phenomena such that I can put them into mathematical equations. I hope to bequeath to the generations a calculus of the nervous system." Now that's a pretty grand plan in my book. In fact, it's so grand that if as an academic I wrote a research proposal with those kind of words in, it would be automatically rejected for being hopelessly overambitious. And that's 200 years later. So she never got to deliver on this. Coming a bit closer to time, up till 2 years ago, I lived in South Manchester in a place called Wilmslow, and about 1.5 miles from where I lived is this rather inconspicuous semi-detached house which has the blue plaque, and this is where Turing lived. And in 1950, while he was at Manchester, Turing wrote one of his seminal papers on computing machinery and intelligence. And it says, "I propose to consider the question, can machines think?" Right, now this was 2 years after the Manchester baby ran the world's first runnable computer program, right? So this was pretty early in the history of what we now think of as a computer. Turing was already wondering how far this technology might take us. In this paper, he reckons all a machine would need, in this paper he proposed the test, which we know as the Turing test, he called the imitation game, and he says all a machine would need to pass his test is a bit more memory. Now by a bit, he meant the Manchester machine had 128 bytes of memory, and he reckoned a gigabyte would be about enough. So it's quite a lot more, and he reckoned we get there by the turn of the century, and that was astonishingly accurate. It was about the turn of the century when your typical desktop PC might have a gigabyte of main memory. It would also have a processor that was 1,000,000 times more powerful than the Manchester baby, but it would not pass Turing's test. And, well, I don't know. Do people reckon large language models pass Turing's test?
No.
No? Is that okay? They're getting closer.
It's on a very interesting point, which is if you don't tell people that there is a test being run, then you can fool people. But it seems much more that people expect that level of interactivity to be human level intelligence. And thus we have a bias to seeing intelligence that isn't there.
Well, yes, I know they're not intelligent, but they're quite good at pretending.
They're not good enough if you put them under directed testing. What I call torturing large language models.
Yes.
so as soon as you get off things that are statistically probable, then they fall apart rapidly. So ask them how many R's in strawberry. A lot of them can now answer that. Ask them to replace every R in the word strawberry with a G, and it gets a lot more difficult for them. And then ask them to say how many G's in this word you just made up, and they're now dead.
Okay, well there you are. Your guidance on how to break large language models from our resident expert. Yes. Okay, so even today machines, powerful as they are, can't pass Turing's test. Now my take on this is that the reason machines still can't convincingly pass Turing's test is because, firstly, Turing thought human intelligence was about logic, and I'm fairly sure it isn't. But also, artificial general intelligence, as it's now called, is about building things that work like the human mind, and we don't know how the human mind works, okay? The human mind is based in the brain. We know lots of fine detail about the brain, but we don't have anything approaching a high-level description of how the brain works. And that's why my interest sort of turned to seeing if I could do something that contributed to that grand scientific challenge of understanding the brain. And the original proposal poses these two high-level questions. We now have formidable computing resources. Can we use those to accelerate our understanding of brain function? And as we learn more about the brain, can we use that knowledge to build better computers, for some value of the word better? And my view was that any significant progress on either of these dimensions would be a contribution to science. So that led to this thing called the SpiNNaker project, where we set ourselves the goal of putting 1 million ARM processors into one computer and running them in parallel to support sort of biological brain-like models. And even at the outset, it's clear that with 1 million processors, you're not near human brain scale, okay? We then estimated it was about 1%, or as I prefer to think of it, 10 whole mice. The mouse brain is very like the human brain, but 1,000 times smaller. But actually even that now I think is optimistic, and on the SpiNNaker machine, if we could get the model, we could probably model about 1 whole mouse at the level of detail that we're using. Because the models we run have got more sophisticated over time as the neuroscientists have learnt more. So how do you build such a system? Well, it's a massively parallel system. You need an architecture. We came down to this approach of thinking of a very large array of nodes, where each node had 2 chips in. One was a SpiNNaker chip we were going to design ourselves, and one was an industry standard memory chip, because one thing the semiconductor industry knows how to make is memory, so you may as well use it. And it took 5 years to put the chip together, because again it's academic research, very small teams. But eventually we ended up with a chip design, 100 million transistors, and a bit of creative packaging. So we put the SpiNNaker chip, which is the big square, a lighter coloured chip, and the memory chip, which is the darker rectangle. We put them in the same package. We literally glue the memory on top of the SpiNNaker chip, and then they're gold wired bonded together, so there's no fancy TSVs for the people in the business, right? Don't do TSVs. It's just gold wire bonding, but then you have a single package with both chips in that you can build things with. And as I say, this took about 5 years. In fact, the 2-chip packaging was suggested to us by the company we were talking to about the packaging. They recommended it rather than us pushing it on them. We can then take that chip, we can assemble a bunch of them onto a board, and the standard board we use has 48 of those chips on. The observant will notice it's a 7x7 square with one missing. That's how it looks. It's really a hexagon. And if you start with 3 hexagons and add layers, you find 48 is one of the magic numbers. So that's 864 ARM cores, and you can then stack these in with 10 fairly standard data center rack cabinets. You can put the boards together and assemble your million processors. And we got the first service running on a half-size machine in 2016. Then in 2018, we completed the million-core machine, and it's been running an open service ever since then under the auspices of the EU Human Brain Project. Well, I say ever since then. On Easter Sunday, you know, a week ago, I started getting little messages on my phone. I retired 18 months ago. Why do I get messages from the university on my phone? These messages were talking about the temperature in the SpiNNaker room. Apparently I'm still on the list. I tend to ignore these, I get quite a lot of them. Then Monday morning, the temperature was approaching 60 degrees. I thought, this isn't good. So it was Bank Holiday Monday. I alerted a few people. Jim Garside was in work that day, as usual. Went into the room and said, yeah, it's a bit warm. And the machine was duly shut down. Dave Clark, who's actually the man in this picture, the technician responsible for the machine, went in and said, yeah, it is a bit warm. If you touch the metalwork, it burns you. And we're still counting the damage, actually. Yeah. The Kilburn building was a purpose-built computer building back in the days when computers were real computers. You know, MU5 was a 128 kilowatt machine. So it has this plant room with these big coolers, and chilled water is a kind of utility, you know, like electricity and gas. And so the SpiNNaker room has a chilled water supply that comes into chillers, and the air from the SpiNNaker machine gets taken out and runs through the chillers where it's chilled, and then just blown back into the room where it then gets sucked through the machine again. So it's a sort of closed air cooling system. The chilled water failed. For some reason, the chilled water was not so chilled. The chillers then keep pumping. They've got 3 kilowatt fans in. So they're adding another 6 kilowatts to the heat source in the room. And yes, everything just goes AWOL. In the SpiNNaker machine, if it were ever working flat out, which it's almost impossible to make it do, it has a power limit of about 100 kilowatts. So it usually runs at, depending on the workload, between a few kilowatts and a few tens of kilowatts. But it's in quite a smallish room. So anyway, I don't know how much of the machine will survive. We're still counting the damage. And again, I'm retired, it's not my problem. It's not the only machine. We've been loaning and selling SpiNNaker machines all around the world, and in fact, not shown on this, a former RA who works now for the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Nanjing has built a 500,000 core SpiNNaker machine under license. So there's over 100 of them around in various different places, and the sort of stuff it does is run brain models, and I've not got a lot of examples here, but one where there's a kind of informal competition between several people is modelling a square millimetre of cortex using a standard model. And there were groups running this on HPCs and on GPUs, and the first machine to achieve real time was SpiNNaker, despite the fact we're using technology more than 20 years older than the HPC and the GPU. So I thought that was a reasonable validation of the architecture. We didn't stop there. We've developed a second generation chip where the number of processors on the chip has gone up from 18 to 152, and everything else has been scaled. And TU Dresden have recently released this picture of their SpiNNaker 2 machine, which has 5 million ARM cores in it. Okay, and they're now, through a spin-out company called SpiNCloud, they're now actively commercializing this technology. And they're targeting energy reduction in large AI models. So porting LLMs and things and running them at a fraction of the power. There's a lot I could say about that, but I've only got 5 minutes. So I wanted to sort of do this, because this is a kind of career reflection, okay? I've been doing chip stuff for about 40 years, since before the ARM 1, until I retired. And you've heard about Moore's law. Gordon Moore in 1965 observed that the number of transistors that could be made on a chip was doubling every roughly 2 years. The 2 years has changed a bit, but and most people have trouble with exponentials. So here's, doubling doesn't sound that dramatic. If you double every 2 years for 20 years, that's 10 doublings. 2 to the 10 is 1024, as everybody in computing knows. Do it for another 20 years, you've got 40 years, and you have a factor of millions. And that's really what's been driving the industry, since ARM 1 to today, and before that, of course. But I thought the interesting reference points were ARM 1 and M1. If I were using my laptop, it's an M1 powered MacBook Air. And has Moore's law really worked over that time? And the answer is yeah, actually. ARM 1 was 25,000 transistors, M1 is 16 billion. I take that as near enough to a factor of a million, not to worry about the difference. And
there's no difference because M1 Pro came out at the same time and there's about 25 billion.
yeah. Yes. Well, there's M4 now, and but I haven't updated the slides for that. So. And what else does Moore's law deliver? Well, how does it deliver it? Principally, it's been delivered by making transistors smaller. Now, I know today's process nodes, how you interpret the numbers is, quite tricky.
Yes, quite.
It's largely marketing, but again, ARM 1 was 3 micron, as we've heard. M1 is a notional 5 nanometer technology. It's roughly a factor of 1,000 in linear dimension, which is a factor of 1,000,000 in areal density. So that's how you get 1,000,000 times more transistors on a chip. And of course, the usual warning, you only get about 4 silicon atoms to the nanometer. So a 5 nanometer transistor, if it were real, would be 20 atoms across. So it probably isn't quite as real as it sounds. But of course, a lot of people think Moore's law is about performance. The original Moore's law is only about transistor count, but actually that translates into performance quite nicely. So ARM 1 was nominally a 6 megahertz maximum clock speed, give or take, 32-bit machine. M1, 3.2 gigahertz, 64-bit. So put both those together, it's about 1,000 times faster. But of course, the M1 chip isn't just a processor like the ARM 1 chip. There are 8 ARM cores on there, 4 for performance, 4 for efficiency. So maybe the throughput's about 10,000x, right, on CPU stuff. So it's not a 1,000,000x, but it's still a very big factor. And I said there's other stuff on there, on the standard Apple picture, which I don't think is anything like to scale. You see the CPU, you see the GPU, the DRAM, they're separate chips. The neural engine, which is the AI hardware support, caches, fabric. There's lots of stuff on there. So you have to be a bit careful with the comparisons, but I'm just trying to give you a very broad brush overview. And how about the memory? The memory's featured fairly visibly in the discussions today, in particular memory bandwidth, but also memory size matters. On the ARM1 evaluation machine, the most popular one had 4 megabytes of main memory in 64 memory packages. The M1 has 8 or 16 gigabytes, and those are actually in 2 packages. You can't, they're sort of black packages on the black substrate and a black background, so it's a bit Hitchhiker's Guide colouring. But the two DRAMs are those 2 chips there. And you can see the memory's grown in size by a factor of 1,000. The density, if you take into account the reduction in number of chips, is something like 100,000x. So again, not quite a million, but still very big numbers. So I think that's, that from the start of my career to the last computer I bought is an interesting reference point to see how Moore's law has actually been manifest. Of course, in Gordon Moore's original 1965 paper, he seems to confidently predict that this law would apply for about 10 years. And it had, the 10 years were over before ARM1.
To what degree do you think this is some prophecy?
Oh, it very much. Yeah. No, it's very much. The US industry guidebook used to be called the International Technology Roadmap for Semiconductors. I don't know what it's called this week. But ITRS was basically plotting Moore's law and saying this is where we have to be then. So it's not a law of nature. It's an observation as to how fast industry was progressing. And it's basically financially limited. So each new process node kind of has to pay for itself before you can move on to the next one. And that stops it going any faster. Now physics is beginning to stop it going any faster, but that's a bit more fundamental. But anyway, I hope that was interesting. And just to sort of conclude, well, we're here to celebrate the first ARM chip, and we've seen this picture enough times, the Acorn RISC machine. And the Archimedes that followed, although that didn't actually go in the Archimedes because there's ARM2 in the Archimedes. That's how we all got started, and how it's going. You've heard about ARM processors are now everywhere. I've chosen a few random pictures here, but if you get Apple's AirPods, I think I was told that each AirPod has a quad-core ARM processor in it. You're sticking 4 high-performance computer cores in each ear. And it's only because they're pretty energy efficient that this isn't very uncomfortable. They're beginning to find their way into sort of desktop computing and laptops. And, the M1 MacBook Air was a real revelation as far as I was concerned. It's the best laptop I ever had by a very large margin. And it didn't have a fan, right? It was just got on with the job. And for a couple of years, the world's #1 high-performance supercomputer was ARM-powered, the Japanese Fugaku machine. I think some nasty NVIDIA GPU box has taken it. That's probably got ARM processors in as well, hasn't it? Yes? I don't know. Yeah, there are ARM cores all over the place. Anyway, so that's a summary. If you want to know more about SpiNNaker, which is not really what we're here to talk about, but we did write a book, and I'm allowed to advertise this because it's free. It's open access in PDF form, so that tells the story of the first 20 years of the project. And there are lots of ARMs in there, so it's relevant. And with that, I will stop, and thank you very much for your attention.
Because this is the anniversary of the first ARM, I've taken the bit about writing the test suites for it and how we managed to convince ourselves this was a good idea, and basically expanded that